"Sir, turn the truck around. You are banned from this property." For a second, I thought the guard had confused me with someone else. I had driven nearly 4 hours that morning to reach my dad's farm, following the same two-lane highway and narrow county roads I had known since childhood. But now, less than half a mile from the farmhouse, a black metal gate stretched across the gravel road where no gate had ever existed before. Beside it stood a small security booth with a polished sign reading Willow Creek Homeowners Association. I lowered my window and looked at the guard. "This property?" I asked. "You mean the Mercer farm?" He glanced at a tablet. "Caleb Mercer? That is me." His expression tightened. "Then yes, you are specifically listed as prohibited from entering." I almost laughed, but something about the situation stopped me. Beyond the gate were the same oak trees my dad had planted along the road decades earlier. The same weathered fence followed the pasture on my left. About 30 feet beyond the security booth stood an old green mailbox leaning slightly toward the ditch. Mercer was still painted across the side in faded white letters. I pointed toward it. "That mailbox has my family name on it because this road leads to my father's farm." "I understand," the guard said, keeping his voice professional. "But I have instructions not to allow you through." "Instructions from my father?" "No, sir." That answer changed everything. My dad, Robert Mercer, had owned this farm for as long as I could remember. I had spent summers repairing fence posts with him, hauling feed, and learning which sections of the gravel road flooded after heavy rain. Willow Creek had not even existed back then. The subdivision had appeared years later along the eastern edge of the property, where open fields had gradually turned into rows of expensive houses. I had heard my dad complain about the HOA occasionally, mostly about letters and disagreements over road access, but nothing that explained this. "Who told you I was banned?" I asked. The guard hesitated before answering. "Vanessa Whitmore, president of the Willow Creek Homeowners Association." I pulled my truck onto the shoulder instead of blocking the gate. A second guard remained inside the booth, while the first one watched me carefully. Neither seemed interested in arguing, and I had no reason to make their job harder. They were following somebody else's instructions. So I took out my phone and called Dad. It rang 4 times before he answered. "Caleb? You close. Closer than you might think. There is an HOA security gate across the road." Silence. "And they say Vanessa Whitmore banned me from entering." Another silence, longer this time. Then Dad exhaled. "Do not argue with them." "Was not planning to." "Where are you?" "At the old East Road." "Stay there. I will call you back." The line went quiet. I stepped out beside my truck and studied the entrance. The gate looked new. Fresh concrete surrounded the posts. 2 cameras faced the road, and a keypad stood beside a stone monument carrying the Willow Creek name. But the landscape behind all that polished hardware was unmistakably Mercer land. I remembered Dad showing me the property maps when I was younger, tracing the boundaries with his finger across yellowed paper. Maybe boundaries had changed. Maybe some agreement had been signed while I was away. I was not going to pretend I knew the answer before checking the records. But one fact bothered me more every second I stood there. Nobody from my family had told me the road belonged to Willow Creek. My phone rang. Dad's name appeared on the screen. "There is another way onto the farm from the north," he said. "Meet me there." "Dad, did you give the HOA control of this road?" He paused. "No." I looked back at the gate, then at the Mercer mailbox sitting beyond it. "Did you give Vanessa permission to decide who can enter?" "Absolutely not." I stared at the HOA sign again, and suddenly the question was no longer why I had been banned. The real question was how an HOA had installed guards, cameras, and a locked gate on a road my father said he still controlled. Before leaving, I asked the guard one final question. "Just so I understand, Vanessa Whitmore personally ordered you not to let Caleb Mercer through this gate?" He checked the tablet once more. "Yes, sir. That is the instruction we were given." I nodded, climbed into my truck, and turned around without touching the gate or raising my voice. 10 minutes later, I was heading toward the north side of the farm with one thought stuck in my mind. If Dad was right about the property line, Willow Creek had not just banned me from my family's land. They had built their checkpoint on it. The north entrance was barely an entrance at all, just a narrow gravel track branching off a county road and running between 2 stretches of pasture. Dad had used it for equipment deliveries years ago, and I remembered bouncing down it in his old pickup when I was a teenager. 20 minutes after leaving the HOA gate, I spotted his faded blue truck parked beside an open cattle gate. Robert Mercer was standing next to it with his arms folded, looking more tired than I remembered. I parked and stepped out. Dad did not waste time on greetings. "You saw the whole setup?" he asked. "Gate, cameras, security booth, guards, and a sign with Willow Creek written across it." His jaw tightened. "That used to be our East Road." "Used to be. Still is, as far as every document I signed is concerned." We drove toward the farmhouse together, passing fields that looked almost exactly as they had when I was growing up. The barn needed fresh paint. One section of fence leaned toward the pasture, and the windmill near the equipment shed made the same faint clicking sound I remembered. But along the eastern horizon, rooftops now rose where there had once been open land. Willow Creek had grown much larger than I expected. Dad poured coffee when we reached the kitchen, then sat across from me at the old oak table. "Start at the beginning," I said. He rubbed one hand across his chin. "About 3 years ago, Willow Creek expanded toward our eastern boundary. Their residents were already using part of the old road because it connects to the county highway. There was an access arrangement tied to that route long before the subdivision got this big. An easement, something along those lines. I need to show you the paperwork before I say exactly what it allows." That was Dad. He would rather admit he needed to check a document than pretend he remembered legal language from years earlier. "So, when did Vanessa get involved?" I asked. "Last year. First came letters about traffic. She said Willow Creek wanted better security because residents were complaining about unfamiliar vehicles. Then they put up signs. On our road. Near it. I objected. Vanessa told me they were temporary." Dad took a sip of coffee. "A few months later, cameras appeared. Then they proposed a controlled entrance." "And you agreed?" "No. I told them I would review whatever authority they believed they had. They kept saying the HOA was responsible for managing community access. I thought about the polished stone monument outside the gate. Temporary was not the word I would have used." "When did the guards arrive?" "Maybe 6 weeks ago. I stopped using that entrance after they started questioning me every time I drove through." I stared at him. "They questioned you on the road to your own farm?" "They asked for identification and wanted vehicle information. I told Vanessa that was unacceptable." "What did she say?" Dad gave a humorless smile. "She said security procedures applied equally to everyone." That sentence told me more about Vanessa than any description could have. "Why did you not tell me?" I asked. "Because I thought it was paperwork, Caleb. I figured their attorney would look at the records, somebody would realize they had gone too far, and the whole thing would disappear." He looked toward the eastern window. "Instead, every month they acted a little more certain that the road belonged to them." There it was. Not one dramatic takeover, but a series of small steps. Signs, cameras, questions, guards, a gate. Each new step made the previous one look normal. "And now I am banned," I said. Dad frowned. "That part is new. Did you ever tell Vanessa I was not allowed on the farm?" "Of course not." "Did you give the HOA authority to approve your visitors?" "No." "Did you sign anything transferring ownership of the road?" "No." His answers came without hesitation. I stood and walked to the window. From the farmhouse, I could see only the distant roofs of Willow Creek, neat rows of houses sitting beyond our fields. The people living there probably had no idea what was happening at the edge of the neighborhood. They saw a gate and guards and assumed somebody had the right to put them there. Maybe Vanessa believed that too. I was not ready to decide. "You still have the deed?" I asked. "Yes." "Surveys?" "Several." "Anything involving that access arrangement?" Dad nodded toward the hallway. "There is a storage box in my office with property records going back decades." I picked up my coffee and followed him. Dad opened the office closet and pulled out a heavy cardboard file box covered in dust. He set it on the desk between us. Across the top, written in my grandfather's handwriting, were 2 words, Mercer Property. Dad rested his hand on the lid. "Before we accuse anybody of anything," he said, "we find out exactly what we own and exactly what they were allowed to use." I nodded. That was exactly what I wanted. Because if the documents showed Willow Creek had legitimate authority, I would accept it. But if they did not, Vanessa Whitmore had spent the last year turning permission to use a road into something very different, and that morning, she had finally pushed it far enough to put my name on a banned list. Dad and I spent nearly 2 hours going through the property box before I decided I needed to hear Vanessa Whitmore explain her position herself. The older records were useful, but some of the language dated back decades, and I did not want to build a conclusion around something I had only half understood. Dad found the most recent deed and set it aside, along with 2 surveys and a folder labeled East Access. I photographed the covers, left the originals with him, and drove toward Willow Creek. The HOA office sat inside a clubhouse near the center of the subdivision, surrounded by trimmed hedges, decorative stonework, and houses that looked carefully arranged along curving streets. Nothing about the neighborhood seemed hostile. A man walking his dog waved as I passed. 2 women were talking beside a row of mailboxes. Whatever dispute existed at the farm boundary, I reminded myself that most people living here probably knew nothing about it. Inside the clubhouse, a receptionist asked my name. Her expression changed slightly when I said, "Caleb Mercer." She disappeared through a doorway and returned less than a minute later. "Ms. Whitmore can see you now." Vanessa was waiting behind a wide desk in an office overlooking the community pond. She was a heavy-set white woman wearing an elaborate cream jacket with gold trim, a bright silk scarf, oversized jewelry, and polished shoes that looked more suited to an expensive hotel than a neighborhood office. Everything about her appearance was deliberate and luxurious. She gestured toward a chair without standing. "Mr. Mercer, I understand there was an issue at the east entrance this morning." "There was. Your guards told me I was banned." The security team followed instructions. "Your instructions?" She folded her hands. "The board authorized stronger access controls because of ongoing concerns around that entrance." "That does not answer my question." Her expression cooled. "Your name was added after repeated concerns involving access to property adjacent to Willow Creek." I almost asked what concerns, but I wanted to keep the conversation focused. "My father says he never gave the HOA authority to decide whether I can enter his farm." Vanessa leaned back. "Your father has been informed that the eastern corridor falls under community access management. Does Willow Creek own the road?" For the first time, she paused. Then she opened a drawer and removed a glossy folder. "I think this will make things clearer." She slid a large printed map across the desk. Willow Creek was shown in carefully marked sections, with streets, common areas, landscaping zones, and the eastern road running beside the development. That road was shaded the same pale gray as several HOA-controlled routes. Vanessa tapped it with one manicured finger. "This is the access corridor. Willow Creek maintains security here." I studied the page. At first glance, it looked official enough. There was a title, a development logo, parcel outlines, and numbered sections. Then I noticed a line of small print along the bottom edge. "Community Planning Map. For association reference." "Is this a recorded survey?" I asked. "It is the map used by the association." That was not my question. Her mouth tightened. "Our position is that the HOA has access authority over this corridor. Based on this map, based on the association records, and the rights connected to the road." That was different from ownership. I pointed to the gray strip. "Does this shading mean Willow Creek owns the land underneath the road?" "It represents the area we manage." "Manage for what purpose?" Vanessa closed the folder halfway, clearly losing patience. "Mr. Mercer, Willow Creek has more than 100 households depending on controlled access. We cannot abandon established security procedures because one person disagrees with them. I am not asking you to abandon anything. I am asking what gives you the right to stop the landowner or his family from using the road." She looked directly at me. "Until this matter is resolved, your restriction remains in place." I stood. "Then I would like the legal basis for that restriction in writing, along with whatever document you believe gives Willow Creek authority to control my father's access." Vanessa gave me a thin smile. "We can provide the relevant association documentation." I nodded and glanced once more at the map. "Good. Because my father kept his documentation too." I left without another argument. Sitting in my truck outside the clubhouse, I opened the photograph I had taken of Dad's newest survey. I enlarged the eastern boundary, then pictured Vanessa's glossy map beside it. They did not describe the road the same way. One of them was a professional survey tied to the Mercer property records. The other called itself a community planning map, and Vanessa had just treated the second one as if there were no difference. When I returned to the farmhouse, Dad was still sitting in his office with the Mercer property box open on the floor. Several folders covered the desk, but one thin brown file was sitting by itself. "Found something," he said. I pulled up a chair. Dad opened the folder and removed a document from years before Willow Creek had grown into the neighborhood it was now. Attached to it was a survey showing the eastern edge of the farm and the gravel road running toward the county highway. "This is the access agreement I remembered," Dad said. I read it slowly. The wording was formal, but the basic arrangement was understandable. The road crossed Mercer property, and certain neighboring parcels had permission to use a defined portion of it for access. The agreement described passage over the road. I saw nothing transferring ownership of the land itself. More importantly, nothing I read gave an association permission to exclude the Mercer family from the road. "So they have a right to use part of it," I said. "That is how I always understood it," Dad replied. "Use it, not own it." I placed the document beside the most recent survey. The boundary line extended across the area where I remembered seeing the security booth and gate. That did not prove every question was settled. Surveys could be updated, rights could be modified, and I was not a property attorney. But the records in front of us told a very different story from Vanessa's planning map. "Did you ever sign an amendment?" I asked. "No." "Anything giving Willow Creek responsibility for security?" "No." "Anything allowing them to install a gate?" Dad shook his head. Then he reached deeper into the box and pulled out 3 envelopes. Each carried the Willow Creek logo. These started arriving last year. The first letter described increased traffic and proposed improved monitoring near the eastern entrance. The second announced that cameras would be installed as part of a community security initiative. The third referred to a controlled access point as though it were already established policy. I arranged the letters by date. The progression was almost too neat. First, Willow Creek wanted to monitor traffic. Then monitoring became security. Then security became controlled access. Somewhere between those steps, permission to travel over a road had apparently become authority to decide who could travel on it. "Did you respond to these?" I asked. Dad opened another folder and handed me copies of 2 letters he had sent. In both, he objected to any restriction affecting his use of the road and asked the HOA to identify the document granting them control. Neither response from Willow Creek answered that question directly. Instead, the association referred repeatedly to community safety, access management, and its responsibilities to residents. I leaned back in the chair. Vanessa did the same thing with me today. Every time I asked about ownership, she answered with management. Dad nodded. That is why I stopped arguing with her. We are not going to argue. I took photographs of the access agreement and surveys, then wrote down their dates so we could locate recorded copies independently. We need somebody who actually understands this paperwork. Dad gave me the name of a local property attorney he had used years earlier. Before calling, I looked again at the survey. Near the eastern boundary were several old reference points, including one beside the road not far from where the new gate appeared to stand. I remembered the fresh concrete around the gate posts and the cameras aimed toward the county road. If that marker was still there, a surveyor could determine exactly where the new structure sat. My phone buzzed on the desk. An email had arrived from Willow Creek. The subject read Access Restriction Notice. I opened it and found a formal message stating that my entry through the eastern corridor remained prohibited pending HOA review. At the bottom was Vanessa Whitmore's name. I turned the screen toward Dad. He read it once and looked at me. She put it in writing. Yes, I said, saving the email with the rest of the records. Until that moment, we had been trying to understand what Willow Creek believed it could do. Now Vanessa had given us something more useful. She had documented exactly what she was doing. The next morning, Dad and I met Daniel Reeves, a licensed surveyor who had worked on agricultural properties around the county for more than 20 years. I showed him the recorded survey, the old access agreement, and photographs of the new gate. Daniel studied everything before saying, I can verify where the recorded boundary sits in relation to what is physically there. I cannot tell you what the HOA is legally entitled to do with an easement. That is for an attorney. That was exactly the kind of answer I wanted. No promises, no dramatic conclusions, just a way to establish facts. We drove separately toward the east side of the farm. I stopped well before the security checkpoint, while Daniel began from reference points accessible from Mercer property. Dad stayed near the farmhouse in case Daniel needed access elsewhere. The same guard from the previous day noticed my truck and walked toward me. Mr. Mercer, the restriction is still active. I know. I am not trying to pass the gate. He looked toward Daniel, who was carrying survey equipment near the fence line. What is he doing? Checking the Mercer property boundary. The guard glanced back at the booth. I need to notify my supervisor. That is fine. I stayed beside my truck. A few minutes later, the second guard came outside and watched from a distance. Nobody interfered, and Daniel continued his work. He located one old reference point, checked measurements against the recorded survey, then moved farther along the boundary. After nearly an hour, he stopped about 40 feet from the security booth and examined the ground near the edge of the road. There should be another reference point around here, he said. We did not cross the controlled entrance. Instead, Daniel took additional measurements from locations he could lawfully reach and recorded what he found. I need to finish the field work and compare everything before I give you a final survey, he said. But the gate is close enough to the recorded Mercer boundary that this needs to be checked carefully. That was enough for me. I did not need a conclusion before the work was complete. As we were leaving, my phone buzzed. Another email from Willow Creek had arrived. This one was longer than the first. It stated that unauthorized attempts to enter through the eastern access point could result in continued restrictions and that all access involving the Mercer property should be coordinated with HOA management. I read that sentence twice. They were no longer talking only about neighborhood residents or community traffic. They were telling us that access involving our own farm should be coordinated through them. Dad was waiting in the kitchen when I returned. I placed my phone on the table and showed him the message. They sent this after seeing the surveyor? He asked. Less than an hour later. Dad shook his head. I never agreed to this. Then we stopped answering them ourselves. That afternoon, we met with Laura Bennett, a property attorney whose office was about 12 miles from the farm. She reviewed the deed, the access agreement, Dad's letters, Vanessa's emails, and the planning map I had photographed at the clubhouse. She spent most of her time on the easement language. Do not assume anything yet, she said. I want recorded copies of every relevant document, and I want the surveyor's completed work. But based on what I am reading here, an easement allowing passage is not automatically ownership, and it does not automatically create unlimited authority over the underlying property. What about banning me? I asked. That depends on the actual rights created by these documents and whether anything later modified them. We verify first. Laura asked me to forward every written communication from Willow Creek and told Dad not to sign anything new. Then she said something that changed our strategy completely. Do not debate Ms. Whitmore about what she thinks she controls. Ask the association to identify, in writing, the recorded instrument they believe gives them that authority. The following morning, Laura sent that request on Dad's behalf. It was simple. Identify the document supporting Willow Creek's claimed power to restrict Mercer family access and control the eastern road. By late afternoon, Vanessa replied. She repeated that the HOA possessed access management authority and that my restriction would remain in effect. But she did not identify a deed transferring the road. She did not identify an amendment giving the HOA ownership. She referred instead to the existing access rights and association security responsibilities. I forwarded the response to Laura. A minute later, she replied with 6 words that made me stare at the screen. Good. Now we verify their claim. 3 days later, Daniel Rees called just after breakfast and asked if Dad and I could meet him at the farmhouse. He arrived carrying a rolled survey, a field notebook, and the careful expression of someone who preferred measurements to opinions. We cleared a space on the kitchen table while he spread out the completed drawing. I compared the field measurements with the recorded survey and the reference points I could verify, he said. His finger moved along the eastern boundary. This is the Mercer parcel. This is the access corridor described in the older documents. And this is the approximate location of the new security installation. I leaned closer. The gate posts, booth, and part of the entrance improvements were shown in relation to the recorded boundary. So where's the gate? Dad asked. Daniel tapped the drawing. Based on my survey, the installation is within the area associated with the Mercer parcel and the access corridor. That tells you where the physical improvements sit. It does not tell you what rights Willow Creek has under the easement. Dad looked at me. That part belongs to Laura. An hour later, we were sitting in Laura Bennett's office with Daniel's survey beside the recorded deed and access agreement. Laura had also obtained copies of the relevant property records through the county recording system. She compared them line by line, then placed Vanessa's latest email beside them. I found no later recorded deed transferring this portion of the Mercer parcel to Willow Creek, she said. I also found no recorded amendment expanding the access agreement into ownership of the underlying land. I pointed toward the old agreement. Then what does Willow Creek actually have? The document provides defined access rights benefiting the parcels described in it. The precise legal effect depends on the language and applicable property law, but nothing I have reviewed supports treating that right of passage as ownership of the road itself. And the gate? Dad asked. Laura folded her hands. That is where the dispute becomes more serious. A party with access rights may have certain abilities related to reasonable use, depending on the agreement and local law. But installing controls that interfere with the property owner's access is a very different question. I would not make a final legal conclusion without following the proper process. But Willow Creek needs to explain its authority. I thought about Vanessa's office and the glossy map shaded to make the road look like another HOA street. She already had a chance. Then we give her a clearer one, Laura said. That afternoon, she sent a formal letter requesting the specific recorded instrument Willow Creek relied upon to install access controls and restrict the Mercer family. She attached no accusations. She did not threaten anyone. She simply asked the HOA to identify the legal basis for what it had already claimed in writing. Vanessa answered the following morning. Her response was confident and surprisingly detailed. She stated that Willow Creek's responsibility for community security required centralized management of the eastern access point, that the existing access rights supported the association's control of traffic through the corridor, and that temporary restrictions could be imposed when management considered them necessary. My name remained on the restricted list. Laura read the response twice. Did she identify a recorded instrument giving the HOA the power to exclude the Mercer family? I asked. No. Did she identify anything transferring ownership? No, Laura pointed to one paragraph. What she did do is clearly state the association's interpretation. That matters because now we are not guessing why the guard stopped you. The strange part was that Vanessa seemed to think the letter strengthened her position. For us, it did something else. It separated the facts into two clean columns. On one side were the deed, Daniel's survey, the recorded access agreement, and the absence of any transfer Laura could locate. On the other side were Vanessa's planning map, her interpretation of access authority, and multiple written statements claiming the power to control entry. Dad stared at the papers for a long moment. So what happens now? We asked them to stop restricting your access while this is resolved, Laura said. And if they refuse, we use the appropriate legal process to determine the party's rights. No arguments at the gate. No removing equipment. No shortcuts. That evening, I drove the north route back to the farm. The trip added almost half an hour compared with the eastern road. When I reached the kitchen, Dad had another Willow Creek envelope waiting on the table. It was a community notice describing the East Gate as an HOA security improvement provided for the benefit of Willow Creek residents. I read it once, then noticed something at the bottom. The notice mentioned that installation and ongoing security costs were being funded through association assessments. I looked toward the distant rooftops beyond Dad's eastern field. For the first time, I realized Vanessa had not only committed the board to her interpretation of the road, she had committed the homeowner's money to it. The community notice changed the way I looked at the dispute, because until then I had assumed Vanessa's decisions affected only Dad and me. Now I knew Willow Creek homeowners were paying for the gate, the cameras, and the guards stationed beside a road whose control was still being questioned. Laura told us not to contact residents or turn the issue into a neighborhood campaign. This gets resolved with documents, she said. Do not make it personal. I agreed. The people living in Willow Creek had bought homes, paid assessments, and trusted their board to make legitimate decisions. They were not responsible for Vanessa's interpretation of the property records. 2 days later, however, one of them contacted Dad. His name was Michael Turner, and his house sat near the eastern edge of Willow Creek. He had known Dad casually for several years and occasionally waved when passing the farm. Michael called after receiving a new HOA notice explaining that security expenses at the eastern entrance would continue as part of the association's access program. Robert, he said over speakerphone, is that gate actually on your property? Dad looked at me before answering. A surveyor has located the installation in relation to my parcel, and my attorney is reviewing the access rights. That is all I am comfortable saying right now. Michael was quiet for a moment. Vanessa told us the HOA controlled that entrance. That is her position. We were told the security project was necessary because the association was responsible for the road. Dad kept his voice calm. You should ask the board for the documents supporting whatever they told you. Michael thanked him and ended the call. By the next afternoon, 2 more homeowners had reached out. Dad gave them essentially the same answer. He did not accuse Vanessa of lying. He did not tell them to challenge the board. He simply said the property rights were disputed and being handled through proper channels. That was enough. Questions started moving through Willow Creek without our help. Laura learned that several residents had requested copies of the board records approving the security project. One homeowner wanted to know how much the gate installation had cost. Another asked why association funds were being used at an entrance connected to private farmland. Vanessa responded by scheduling a community meeting. We knew because Michael forwarded Dad the public notice. Laura advised us not to attend unless invited, so we stayed at the farm. The following morning, Michael called again. You should know what happened last night, he said. According to him, Vanessa had stood before the homeowners in an expensive bright red jacket, gold jewelry catching the clubhouse lights, and insisted that the board had acted within its authority. When residents asked whether Willow Creek owned the road, she reportedly shifted back to the same language she had used with me: access management, security responsibility, community control. Then Michael asked whether the board had a deed showing HOA ownership of the road. Vanessa answered that ownership was not the relevant issue because the association possessed access rights. That distinction did not calm the room. It made people ask more questions. Michael said a board member finally acknowledged that the HOA's position was based largely on its interpretation of the existing access agreement. I looked at Dad across the kitchen table. They are finally asking the question we asked on day 1. Dad nodded. Who actually owns the road? Later that afternoon, Laura received a letter from an attorney representing Willow Creek. Unlike Vanessa's emails, the language was careful. The attorney acknowledged that the Mercer family held title to the underlying parcel while maintaining that the association possessed rights connected to the access corridor. He proposed that both sides refrain from changing physical conditions while the scope of those rights was reviewed. Laura called us immediately. This is progress, she said. Their attorney is separating ownership from access rights. That is exactly what needed to happen. Does that remove my restriction? I asked. Not yet. I am demanding that they suspend it while the issue is resolved. Dad looked frustrated, but I could see something shifting. Vanessa had spent weeks speaking as though ownership, access, management, and control were interchangeable. Her own attorney was no longer doing that. The next morning, Daniel returned to mark several verified boundary reference locations for the legal review. I watched from inside the Mercer property while he worked. Beyond the eastern field, the security booth still stood beside the road, polished and official-looking. But now I understood how little appearances mattered. A gate could look permanent. A sign could look authoritative. A uniformed guard could make an instruction feel official. None of those things answered the underlying property question. My phone buzzed with a message from Laura. Willow Creek had agreed to a temporary arrangement allowing Dad unrestricted passage while the dispute was reviewed, but they had not yet removed my restriction. I read the message twice. They will let you through, I told Dad. But not me. He frowned. That makes no sense. Maybe not, I said, looking toward the gate. But now they have to explain why. And for the first time since I arrived, Vanessa was no longer the only person inside Willow Creek asking everyone else to accept her answer. Laura called the temporary arrangement progress, but she was not willing to accept a rule that allowed Dad through while keeping me on Vanessa's restricted list. The following Monday, she met with Willow Creek's attorney to review the documents both sides claimed supported their positions. Dad and I attended with her, along with Daniel Reeves, who brought his completed survey. Vanessa sat across the conference table wearing a royal blue jacket with gold buttons, a patterned silk scarf, and enough jewelry to make every small movement noticeable. She looked as confident as she had in her office, but this time the table was covered with recorded property documents instead of association brochures. Willow Creek's attorney began by acknowledging what Laura had already established. The Mercer family held title to the land beneath the disputed section of road. The remaining question was what authority the existing access agreement gave Willow Creek and whether the security installation interfered with the Mercer family's rights. Vanessa immediately opened a folder. This is the map our association has relied on for years, she said, sliding the same glossy document across the table. I recognized the gray-shaded corridor instantly. Laura looked at it, then asked, Is this a recorded survey? Vanessa's attorney answered before she could. No, it appears to be a community planning document. Laura placed Daniel's survey beside it. The difference was obvious even before anyone discussed the details. Daniel's work identified measured boundaries and reference points tied to recorded records. Vanessa's map showed the subdivision as the HOA wanted residents to understand it. The planning map illustrates access and management areas, Vanessa said. It does not need to show ownership to demonstrate the association's responsibilities. That is exactly the issue, Laura replied. Management responsibilities cannot simply be assumed to include the power to exclude the owner or the owner's invited family from the underlying property. She turned to the old access agreement. This document allows defined passage benefiting certain parcels. Where does it authorize Willow Creek to ban Caleb Mercer from accessing the Mercer farm? The room became quiet. Vanessa's attorney read the relevant language again. He did not offer an immediate answer. Instead, he asked about the reason for my restriction. Vanessa said there had been concerns about uncontrolled access. Specific concerns involving Mr. Mercer? Laura asked. Vanessa paused. The restriction was preventative. Had he previously entered Willow Creek without authorization? Not that I am aware of. Had he interfered with residents? No. Then what specific conduct caused his name to be placed on the list? Vanessa shifted in her chair. He was not registered through the association's access system. Dad finally spoke. He was driving to my farm. Why would my son need your registration to visit me? Vanessa looked toward her attorney, but the answer never came. That was the moment the entire dispute became simple enough that even I could see its shape. Willow Creek might have rights to travel over part of the road. That did not automatically mean every person traveling to Mercer property became subject to Vanessa's approval. Her attorney requested a short break. When the meeting resumed, his tone had changed. Willow Creek would suspend my restriction immediately while the parties finalized a written access arrangement. The guards would be instructed not to interfere with Mercer family access. The HOA would also review the location and operation of the gate, so its security measures did not obstruct rights belonging to the property owner. Laura insisted on written confirmation before we left. We received it that afternoon. There was no dramatic courtroom ruling and no instant punishment. There did not need to be. The recorded deed, the access agreement, Daniel's survey, and Vanessa's own written claims had done what arguments at the gate never could. 2 days later, Willow Creek circulated another notice to residents. It explained that the eastern road crossed privately owned property subject to access rights, and that the board was reviewing the security arrangement. Michael Turner called Dad after receiving it. That is not what they told us when they approved the gate, he said. Dad answered carefully. At least they are correcting it now. Later, I drove with Dad toward the eastern entrance for the first time since my arrival. We stopped about 100 feet before the gate. The old Mercer mailbox still leaned beside the road, its faded white letters almost hidden beneath years of weather. Beyond it, the polished HOA sign looked exactly as official as before, but the meaning had changed. Vanessa's planning map had been introduced to convince me that Willow Creek controlled the corridor. In the end, that same map helped expose the mistake. It showed what the HOA managed, not what the HOA owned. Dad looked through the windshield and smiled slightly. Ready? I looked at the gate that had stopped me days earlier. This time, my name was no longer on the banned list. Dad and I rolled toward the eastern gate at the same slow speed I had driven that road hundreds of times growing up. Nothing about the entrance looked different. The cameras were still mounted above the security booth, the black metal gate still crossed the gravel road, and the Willow Creek monument still stood beside landscaping that had not existed when I was a kid. Yet everything felt different because this time the question of whether I belonged there had already been answered. I lowered my window as we reached the booth. The guard who had stopped me on my first morning stepped outside. He recognized me immediately, but instead of reaching for his tablet, he pressed a control inside the booth. The gate began to open. "Mr. Mercer," he said, "we received updated instructions. You and your father have unrestricted access to the farm." I nodded. "Thank you." There was no reason to make him part of a dispute he had not created. Dad and I drove forward, passing the old green mailbox with Mercer still faded across its side. For some reason, seeing that mailbox affected me more than watching the gate open. It had been standing there long before Willow Creek, before cameras, before security guards, before anyone decided a polished planning map could make decades of property records disappear. Dad looked at it too. "Your grandfather painted that name himself," he said. "I remember." We continued toward the farmhouse, but the dispute did not simply vanish once my restriction was lifted. Over the next several weeks, Laura worked with Willow Creek's attorney to create a written arrangement that respected the existing access rights without allowing HOA security procedures to interfere with Mercer family access. The association agreed that neither Dad nor his invited visitors would need HOA approval to reach the farm. The security system could serve Willow Creek residents, but it could not be operated as though the HOA owned the underlying Mercer property. The physical gate arrangement also had to be reviewed so that Dad's access did not depend on permission from a neighborhood board. Willow Creek's board eventually sent residents a fuller explanation of the situation. Michael Turner told us the conversations inside the community had changed. Homeowners were asking more questions about major projects, property records, and how association money was approved. I was glad they were asking, but I never wanted them blamed for what happened. Most had trusted the information they were given. Vanessa remained president while the board reviewed its procedures, although she became noticeably less visible in communications about the eastern entrance. I saw her only once after the meeting. Dad and I were leaving Laura's office when Vanessa crossed the parking lot toward her vehicle. She stopped for a moment and looked at us. "Mr. Mercer," she said to Dad, then nodded toward me. "Caleb." There was no apology, but there was no speech about community authority either. "Vanessa," Dad replied. And that was it. Strangely, I preferred it that way. This had never needed to become personal. The important thing was that a misunderstanding about access rights had grown into something far larger because nobody stopped to separate permission, management, and ownership until a locked gate forced the issue. A month after my first arrival, I drove the eastern road alone just before sunset. The fields on both sides were glowing in the late afternoon light, and the farmhouse roof appeared beyond the trees exactly where I remembered it. The gate opened without delay. No questions, no approval, no restricted list. I passed the mailbox and thought about how easily I could have reacted differently that first morning. I could have argued with the guards, blamed the residents, or treated confidence as proof of wrongdoing before checking a single record. None of that would have answered the only questions that mattered. What did the deed say? Where was the boundary? What rights had actually been granted? The answers had been sitting in Dad's dusty property box, while a much newer map was being treated like something it was not. When I parked beside the farmhouse, Dad was on the porch with 2 cups of coffee. I sat beside him and looked across the eastern pasture toward Willow Creek. "Funny," Dad said. "They told you that you could not come home." I smiled. They were looking at the wrong map. Maybe that was the lesson I carried away from all of it. Authority can look convincing when it comes with gates, signs, official letters, and confident people, but appearances do not rewrite ownership. What would you have done if a guard told you that you were banned from land your own family had owned for decades? Would you have stayed calm and checked the records? Or would that gate have pushed you too far? Share what you think, and if stories about ordinary people standing their ground with patience, evidence, and common sense are worth hearing, subscribe and stay with us for the next one.